Okay, so now we've got those controls into place. We want to start to rename these before we go any further. So cc underscore left underscore arm fk control 01, and we'll just copy the name, and for this arm we're just going to put forearm, so, and just put a capital A because it's a word that's continuing on. And then we're just going to copy these names, and I'm just going to put grp underscore for group, delete that control, and after fk just put rot off for rotate offset. So just keeping the naming conventions consistent, keeping the names the same, so we know what each thing will do. And with these groups here, we can just hit Control to select both of them, select all the attributes, and just go lock and hide selected, because we don't need to deal with those rotates anymore. The animator is going to have no influence on those rotates, so it doesn't matter that there's rotates in there, so we don't need to freeze transformations on them. And in here we can actually see we have some scaling and translates on these controls. So before we move on, we want to clean these up. And it's important that we know that we rotated these controls to align with the bone. So if there's any rotations in there, you can have a problem, and you'd probably want to go to the last video and retrace your steps and see what went wrong. But if we've moved these or scaled these, we shouldn't have a problem really. So we can just select these again and just hit freeze transformations. And we can still see, just double checking, that these rotations align with the bone. And don't worry too much if you get a bit paranoid, so I'm just pressing plus and minus to increase the size of the rotate tool. That this doesn't align with this bone here, there's a slight offset, but again that's because we chose to align it to the first bone. So actually this second control is aligned to this bone here. Okay, so now we can start adding these FK controls in here. So what I'm going to do here is, first off I'm just going to put my selection mask back on, to click everything. So we can select the IK, and in the IK I'm just going to scroll down to IK blend and set this to 0. So basically we're switching the IK off. So with IK on, these rotations of these joints, even though there's no actual rotation colour in here telling it's connected, we can't manually rotate these because they are driven by the IK. But setting that to 0 means we're now free to rotate these joints freely, so we can test if the FK is working correctly. So all we're going to do here is, again I'm just going to select these two groups and just move them to the control objects, so getting everything in order as we go along. So now all we need to do is select the curve, select the joint, and hit constraint and orient. Let's go to the options, and we'll keep maintain offset on, and I usually keep this on with the rotations of objects because usually things won't align up for the most cases, but we did align these up so it shouldn't pose a problem, but I'll just keep that on. And then for the second one down here, what we can actually do is, we don't want the on orient constraint for these two joints here, because we don't want this control to rotate both these joints, because just for instance we'll go ahead and do that. So if I selected the control, this bone, hit orient, now if I rotate that, we're going to get the problem where we're getting that sharp angle again. It's basically ignoring that we've added that second joint in there. So what we might be convinced to do is also orient the second bone. And we're not getting things working how we would expect. So what we want to do in here is actually use a few. So I'm just hitting Control Z to go back again. And if you ever want to delete a constraint, there's a couple of ways you can do it. So either in the attribute editor we can select, so underneath below where it's got the shapes, it's actually got all its inputs. So we can take this name of the constraint by hitting Control C, and up at the top here I can select the mode to select by name, paste the name in there, hit enter, and now we've selected that object, so I could just hit delete and delete that constraint. Or another way we can do that is if we expand, so actually select the joint first, and we'll just press F in the outliner to frame it up. And we can see here that underneath left elbow A we have this exclamation mark, and this is actually a constraint. So anything with an exclamation mark just means constraint, and we can just select this object and just hit delete, and that's going to delete the constraint. Oop, press F again. Oh, actually I deleted the constraint on the wrong bone, so I'm just going to hit Control Z to go back. That was the shoulder. So again, the name conventions, we can see how important they are, even though I didn't pay attention to it. So select this bone, and I'll expand that bone because the constraint's going to be underneath it. And elbow A and hit delete. So we can see. And another way to do this, again, is if we select the bone, select the three channels it's editing, and we can right click break connections, and that's going to get rid of the same constraint again. Now we can see here that the orange constraint stayed behind, but it has no effect, so we'll probably just want to go through the outliner's best way and just delete it. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to set up a way that we can distribute the rotation between these two joints, and there's a couple of ways we can do that. We can either use mel with expressions, so the rotate y of this control curve equals the rotate x, or if we select that joint, the rotate y of these two joints divided by 2, so that way it gets applied to both joints half. But the problem with expressions is if you have an expression for your rig, it calculates no matter what you do on every frame, unless you set any conditions so it doesn't. So basically every frame, if this character is not moving, if this character's arm is staying still, the expression is going to still calculate. So every single frame it's going to check, has this control been rotated, should these rotate. And if you have a lot of expressions, or if you were animating a scene with a lot of characters and each one of these characters had quite a few expressions calculating every few seconds, it's going to lag Maya. So a more efficient way is if we use shader nodes, and the way that shader nodes work is they look above themselves and see if anything's changed. So these joints will basically query what's above them and say, it'll be asking, has this curve moved? If it hasn't moved, don't do anything, don't evaluate, don't waste Maya's time trying to calculate where we should rotate, because this control hasn't moved, so we shouldn't move. So it's just a more efficient way. So to do this we're going to go to Windows, Rendering Editors, and Hypershade. It's going to take a couple of seconds to come up, and it's mainly used for shading and shaders and rendering and shader networks, but we'll be using it for a lot of rigging. So first off, what we can do is we can close the top because we don't need the materials, and I'm just going to click this icon underneath File to bring up the creation menu over here, so the creation bar. And what we're looking for is a multiply divide node. So most of the rigging nodes that we're going to be using will be in utilities, but we can type in here at the top for the search and just put mul, and you can see how quickly it's going to find that object. And just by clicking it in here, it's going to create it in the work area. So I'll just click that again to hide the sidebar. And what we can do here is we can start to add objects to this work area. So what we were working with is the control curve. I'm just going to shift select both of these joints, and then just go to graph, add selected to graph, and I'll just rearrange these. And again, I'm using the normal controls: Alt middle mouse click and drag to move about, Alt right click to zoom in and out. So I'm just going to arrange these in some sort of graph. And the way this basically works is, I don't know how you were taught maths when you were younger, but some cases is where you have like a maths machine where you take a number, put through this machine, and a number comes out, and then inside this machine it's usually like times by 5 plus 3 or something like that, and then it spurts a number out. And this is basically how node-based systems work. Is you can see on these joints they've already got an arrow going between them. So if we go on that, hover over it, you can see what the name says. So what we can do here is we can either, so actually before we explain how it's going to work, I'll just double click on the multiply divide node to bring that up in the attribute editor, just so we can explain a bit more what's going on in here. So what happens is different nodes have different things on them. So the multiply divide node has 3 inputs, 3 inputs for input 1, 3 inputs for input 2, and this usually equates to XYZ or RGB if you're working with shaders. And it has an operation, so all it's going to do is multiply this number with this number and output an X value. Multiply this number with this number, output a Y, and again an output a Z. Or we can change the operation to divide, and it'll divide these two numbers, or power, and it'll raise it to the power of that number. So what we will be doing here is we will be dividing, or actually we could multiply, and all I'm going to do is set these 3 values to 0.5. So if you times in by a half, it's going to half the value that comes in here. Now all we can do is drag this curve, middle mouse click and drag, and drop onto the multiply divide node and go to other. So going to other is going to bring up the connection editor. So the connection editor again is just a list of all the attributes on these objects, and if some aren't displayed you can go left display and show readable, show outputs. So we can, if they're not displaying in here, you can click a few of these options to see if it brings up any more, like show hidden, so some of these attributes might be hidden, and you can do the same on the right. And basically we're going to take from the left, it's going to control something on the right, and we can do things like select an object and then go reload left to load a different object in there if you want to. So all we're going to do is take the rotate Y, so if you scroll down here to rotate Y, and we're going to input that into the input X. So what we can actually do here as well is, what we're going to do is we could just have the full rotation of these objects. So one thing about rigging is you'll see a lot of people trying to limit the rigging, so they will try to just have this control just rotating Y, so you can just get that bend. And the elbow is a hinge joint, so you'd expect it to rotate like that, and that's perfectly normal, and for most animation that's all you're ever going to do. But the only problem is with cartoony animation, there might be a case where you want to break that joint. You want his arm to bend up in an unrealistic way, or there might be a few frames where you have an extreme pose where his arm bends slightly up. So get some exaggeration in there, because really this is a cartoon character. He's not a representation of life. If you watch Scooby-Doo, Looney Tunes, they're not a lot of the time they're moving in a normal way, but like Roadrunner, his legs spin round. That's not a normal way to walk or run, but that's the cartoony way. We can break the laws of how things work. So again with the arm here, it's a hinge joint, but to give the animator more control, why can't we just make it so they can rotate it any direction they want? If they want it to be realistic, they'll only rotate the Y, but we want to leave that flexibility in there so they can twist the joints, they can break the joints and do what they want with them. So what we're actually going to do in here is we're going to create a couple of multiply divide nodes. So I'm going to hit Control D to duplicate this, and what this is going to be is the top one is the X, Y and Z rotation for the first joint, the bottom one is the X, Y, Z rotation of the second joint. So we're not just rotating in Y now. So again, I'll just close the connection editor and reuse that. We'll middle mouse click, drag to the top, go to other, and what we're going to do here is scroll down to rotate, and we can expand these if we just want to constrain a few of them. but we're gonna constrain X, Y, and Z. So we can just hit rotate, and then same, you can expand this, but we're going to just put it into input 1 and hit close. And you can see on this multiply divide node now we've got this black in here, and you can see in the attribute editor, the channel box editor, sorry, it's turned yellow. And what we were on about colours earlier, red's keyframe, blue's constraint, yellow means a connection through the connection editor, so some sort of graph network. So what we can do here is, and usually you will see lines coming across these objects, so you can see that this joint is influencing this joint because it's parented to it. Sometimes with rotate you don't see these lines coming up, and a few other connections you don't see a visible line, so don't worry, it is actually there because you can see the colour, but not always. It's not always going to show up in the hypershade. So we'll do the same. And another way we can actually do this is if we left click on the bottom arrow down here, or right click, sorry, so I'll hold right click and go to rotate and click rotate, and it's now giving us this line, and we can go to the left arrow of this multiply divide node, so the bottom left, right click again, go to left click this time, sorry, and go to input 1, and that's going to do the exact same we did through the connection editor. So you can use either way that you want. You can mouse click and drag and drop on, or use the connection editor. So basically now we're taking the rotate of this and just dividing it by 2, and then we're going to add that to the objects. I've just realised I've just been a bit stupid there, because we're adding the same rotations to these objects, we don't really need 2 nodes because the rotation is divided by 2 each time, so we're just dividing by the same amount. So these 2 nodes are going to output the same X, Y, and Z. So that's me being stupid on my part. I'm just going to delete that, and we're just going to use one multiply divide node. So what we're going to do here is middle mouse click, drag and drop onto the joint, and click over, and you can see here it actually gives us a few defaults like default, rotate, scale. So we'll click on rotate and see what that gives us. And what it's going to do as a default is it's just going to connect it to that rotate. So some cases if you drag and drop, it'll give you a few options that you might want to choose, but you can always go to other or more if there's more connections you want to attach it to. So we've attached them both to the rotate, and again you can see here that the joints have yellow in the channel editor. So now if we select this control and rotate it, we can now, so I'm just going to close the hypershade, we can now see that it's like if I rotate this -90, and we'll select this joint, you can see -45, -45. So we have a total of 90 degrees in that rotation, which is what we want, but it's working in a way that we don't get that sharp, harsh angle. We now have that nice, smooth, double jointed elbow. So if we get to this extreme pose, the skinning is going to be a lot better, the character's going to look a lot better, and that way it's just evenly distributed between those 2 joints. So this is going to be a lot better. Okay, so, and again, because we constrained all 3, this is going to work in all 3 axes. So now we can break his arm and twist it up if we want. So in my opinion, it's always best to leave it up to the animator, and especially for cartoon animation, it's always best to add all 3 axes. Don't limit it just so it's a hinge joint, because if the animator then says, oh, I want to just bend it up slightly, or there might be a case where it does break his arm, some sort of comical fight scene, or he has an accident where his arm's been broken, and if that happened, you'd have to go back to the rigger and say, hey, can I have this put into the rig? If you just add it at the start, it just means it's a lot more flexible for the animator. Okay, so now we have the, and you can see this, the last control here, as we're rotating this, and we have a problem here. So later on, actually earlier on, because we froze transformations and we'd moved this, we can see the pivot's been moved. back into the center. So if we try to rotate this, we're not going to like this. This isn't what we want. So what we can actually do here is, in the move tool, just press insert to bring up the pivot point and just vert snap it back to that joint. And because we're only moving the pivot, we're not changing the rotation of this, so we're not going to have any problems. And what we can actually do here now is I'm going to select the second curve, press up to select the rotate offset and just frame it up. And we're selecting the rotate offset because what we're going to do is parent this to this other control. So as we rotate this control, we're also rotating the lower control. And we'll make sure we select the group, not the curve, because we want to keep the curve inside that group. And I'm just going to middle mouse click and drag it onto that left arm FK01. And you can see here that we're getting a major problem because we've locked the controls in here, but what you'll be able to see in here is actually the scale, the translates would change because we're taking that group and inputting it into the rotate offset of this group. So that's going to do the same, it's going to give us an offset. So this is a case where we don't want to parent this actually. What we need to do is select the upper arm control, control click the rotate offset group of the forearm control and go to constraint and parent. And I'll just bring up the option box and make sure maintain offsets on and we've constrained in all and just hit apply. And one error we're going to get here is could not constrain connections, and again this is because we locked these controls earlier on. So if we ever lock anything and we need to unlock it, what we can do is go to edit, channel controls, and this is a case where when you're rigging you're going to get a few problems, like these errors might pop up, and as you're learning rigging these errors are going to cripple you if you don't know how to fix them. So like trying to add a simple constraint there, we got an error, and if we didn't know that it was because these are locked, we might spend ages like looking about for tutorials, trying to figure it out on our own or asking for help. So when it comes to rigging, people sometimes find it hard, but it's always the little small things that cripple a rig from being made. So the best thing to do is just try to learn as much as possible where you can get all these little tools you can find, all these little things you might need to know. So when you do get an error like this and it tells you you can't make that connection, we instantly know where it is and we can just go straight to it and we don't have to spend a lot of time worrying about it. So I'm just going to go to the translate and I'll just bring the scale and rotate along with us at the same time. And all we need to do is, on the left we've got keyable, non-keyable displayed. So with these selected, I'm just going to hit move with it's got two arrows pointing to the left. So move it back to the left. And anything that's keyable is displayed in the channel box. So now these are displayed, so we can select them, right click and unlock selected. And again, we'll select the control, select the group, go to constraint, parent, make sure everything's checked and just hit apply and close. So now we can see it's constrained that up. If you want, after it's been constrained, you can lock it and hide them again if you want. But this just means that now when we rotate this, the control below is going to follow along. So now we can get that nice arc and start rotating these into place and everything's working along. Okay, so that's just how we're going to set up the actual FK for the arm. So one thing I'm going to do now is before the start of the next lesson, I'm just going to do what we did before with these controls. I'm going to select these controls and move them across to the opposite side. And so when we come back to the next tutorial, I'm just going to repeat the steps done in this video, just taking these controls to the other side and orient constraining up and setting up on the same side.